All right, welcome back, everybody, for another deep dive. Today we're going to be tackling America's involvement in proxy wars, and it's a topic that's definitely been in the headlines and sparking some pretty serious debate. And you've given me a whole stack of sources on this, and I have to admit, it's a little bit daunting, but luckily we've got an expert here to help us kind of break it all down.
Yeah, it's a complex issue, but understanding proxy wars is really essential if you want to get a handle on the dynamics of modern international relations.
Okay, so first things first, let's define what we're even talking about here. The term proxy war kind of sounds like something from a history textbook, but it's way more relevant than you might think.
Oh, absolutely. At its core, a proxy war is basically a conflict where major powers use third parties as surrogates instead of directly fighting each other. It's a way to advance their interests and influence the outcome of conflicts without a full-blown military confrontation.
Okay, so it's kind of like a game of chess, but instead of moving pieces directly, you're kind of manipulating other players to achieve your objectives.
That's a really good analogy. And proxy wars aren't exactly a new phenomenon. History is full of examples. Take the Vietnam War, for instance. The U.S. supported South Vietnam against the Communist North, which was backed by the Soviet Union and China. It was like a classic Cold War proxy conflict.
Right, and all of those Cold War rivalries really helped shape global events. It makes you wonder why major powers would even choose this indirect approach. What are the advantages of fighting a war through somebody else's hands?
Well, there are several strategic benefits. First off, it allows powerful nations to exert influence and achieve their goals, but without all the political and military risks of direct involvement. Direct military intervention can lead to significant casualties, public disapproval, and even international condemnation. A proxy war kind of allows them to maintain a degree of plausible deniability and avoid those costs.
So it's a way to keep your hands relatively clean while still kind of getting things done.
In a sense, yes. Secondly, proxy wars can be a way to weaken rivals without directly engaging them in battle. By supporting opposing factions in a conflict, major powers can drain their adversaries' resources, destabilize their regions of influence, and even undermine their international standing.
That's a pretty clever way, albeit cynical way, to play the game of geopolitics.
It certainly does highlight the strategic calculations behind these conflicts. Now, if we move beyond the Cold War, the source material you provided specifically highlights the Yemen Civil War and the Syrian Civil War as examples of more recent U.S. involvement in proxy conflicts.
Yeah, the Yemen conflict really caught my eye. It's been going on for years, with all these different groups fighting, and it just seems like a tangled mess with no end in sight. The source material mentions the U.S. backing the Yemeni government against the Houthi movement, which is supported by Iran. Can you unpack that a bit more for us?
Of course. The conflict in Yemen is incredibly complex, with a multitude of internal factions and external actors all vying for power. The U.S. support for the Yemeni government is part of a broader strategy to counter Iranian influence in the region. Iran, on the other hand, sees backing the Houthis as a way to project its power and challenge Saudi Arabia, a key U.S. ally in the Middle East.
So it's not just about Yemen itself, it's about a larger power struggle between the U.S. and Iran, playing out on Yemeni soil.
Exactly. And that's one of the reasons why proxy wars can become so protracted and difficult to resolve. The underlying geopolitical rivalries often fuel the conflict, making it harder to reach a negotiated settlement.
That makes sense. The sources also use the term endless wars to describe some of these conflicts. What makes these wars seemingly endless? Is it just the complex web of alliances and rivalries you mentioned?
That's a significant factor. The involvement of multiple actors with their own agendas, constantly shifting alliances, and the unwillingness of the major powers to disengage all contribute to the seemingly perpetual nature of these conflicts. Plus, the very nature of a proxy war, with its indirect involvement and lower stakes for the major powers, makes it easier for them to sustain the conflict over long periods. There's less domestic pressure to end the fighting compared to a direct military intervention.
So in a way, it's almost like a low-intensity conflict that just simmers on the back burner of international politics.
That's a good way to put it. And this simmering conflict can have devastating consequences. The humanitarian costs are immense. Yemen, for example, is facing a catastrophic humanitarian crisis, with widespread famine, disease, and displacement. And while the major powers may not be directly engaged in the fighting, they bear some responsibility for the human suffering that results from these conflicts.
That brings up a whole other layer to this, the ethical considerations of proxy wars. Speaking of ethical concerns, one thing in the source material really surprised me, and it's a bit unsettling to be honest. It's this thing called the 127E program. What exactly is that? And how does it fit into this whole picture?
The 127E program is a relatively obscure but highly controversial authority that allows U.S. Special Operations Forces to work by, with, and through foreign partners in counterterrorism operations around the world.
So we're talking about U.S. Special Forces teaming up with foreign troops in covert operations. That sounds incredibly secretive and potentially risky.
It is, and that's where the controversy lies. The program grants U.S. Special Operations Forces a great deal of flexibility and autonomy in conducting these operations, often with limited oversight.
Limited oversight. That sounds like a recipe for potential problems.
It certainly raises concerns about accountability and transparency. The program has been criticized for its lack of congressional and diplomatic oversight, and some experts argue that it could potentially violate the U.S. Constitution. The source material explicitly states there are concerns about its constitutionality, with some legal scholars suggesting it gives the executive branch excessive power to engage in military operations without proper authorization.
But potentially unconstitutional. That definitely raises some red flags. I mean, if there's limited oversight and potential constitutional issues, how do we ensure that these operations are conducted responsibly and ethically? And what are the implications for America's image on the world stage?
Those are all valid and pressing questions, and they lead us directly into another major concern raised by your source material: the ethical implications of proxy wars, especially regarding human rights. I mean, the very nature of proxy warfare raises some serious ethical questions. Like, when we support one side in a conflict, we inevitably become entangled in the actions of that side, even if indirectly. And when our partners engage in human rights abuses, it raises some tough questions about our own complicity and responsibility.
Yeah, it's like that saying, you're judged by the company you keep, but on a global scale, right? If we're partnering with groups known for human rights violations, it definitely reflects poorly on us.
Precisely. And it can have some very tangible consequences. The source material really emphasizes how perceived hypocrisy on human rights. It can damage America's credibility and undermine its diplomatic efforts. Countries may be less inclined to cooperate with us if they believe we prioritize our own interests over human rights.
So it's not just about looking bad. It can actually harm our ability to achieve our foreign policy goals.
Absolutely. It creates a trust deficit. When we condemn human rights abuses in one context but overlook them in another, it appears that we apply a double standard. And this inconsistency allows other countries, particularly those with questionable human rights records, to point fingers and dismiss our criticisms as hypocritical.
It almost feels like we're giving them ammunition to deflect scrutiny and justify their own actions.
Exactly. It weakens our moral standing and makes it harder to hold others accountable. The source material even highlights a specific example of this dynamic at play. It discusses how the U.S. continued working with a battalion in Cameroon accused of atrocities, raising serious concerns about the lack of human rights vetting in programs like 127E.
Yeah, I remember reading about that. It's incredibly disturbing. How can we, as a nation that champions human rights, justify actions like that? Where do we draw the line?
That's the crucial question. Balancing security interests with moral imperatives. It's a constant challenge in foreign policy. But the source material argues that overlooking human rights abuses, even in the pursuit of counterterrorism objectives, ultimately undermines our long-term security interests.
How so? I mean, wouldn't turning a blind eye to those abuses, at least in the short term, help us achieve our immediate goals?
It might seem that way initially, but remember, these actions have repercussions. When we align ourselves with forces known for brutality, we risk alienating populations, fueling resentment, and even creating more fertile ground for extremism. It's what's often referred to as blowback. Our actions can inadvertently create the very conditions that we're trying to prevent.
So it's a bit of a paradox. We think we're promoting stability by supporting certain groups, but in reality, we might be sowing the seeds of future instability.
That's the danger. And it's a key argument made in the source material. It suggests that a more sustainable approach to counterterrorism requires prioritizing human rights, promoting good governance, and addressing the root causes of instability. Simply propping up regimes or militias with questionable human rights records is a short-sighted strategy that can backfire spectacularly.
It sounds like we need to take a more holistic view, considering the long-term consequences of our actions.
Precisely. And that brings us back to a fundamental question. If proxy wars are so ethically problematic and potentially counterproductive, why does the U.S. continue to engage in them?
Well, I guess proponents would argue that they're a necessary tool, for combating terrorism and advancing U.S. interests in a complex world. They might say that sometimes you have to make tough choices and get your hands dirty to protect national security.
That's a very common argument. But the source material challenges us to critically examine those claims. It suggests we need to ask ourselves some tough questions, like, is supporting one side in a conflict, even if they have a dubious human rights record, truly the most effective way to combat terrorism? Or could it actually exacerbate the problem by fueling resentment and radicalization? Are we truly advancing our long-term interests? Or are we simply perpetuating cycles of violence and instability?
It sounds like we need a more nuanced and strategic approach, one that considers the ethical implications and long-term consequences of our actions.
I agree. And it's not just about policymakers and government officials. We as citizens have a role to play as well. We need to stay informed, engage in critical thinking, and hold our leaders accountable for their decisions.
That's a powerful reminder. We can't just sit back and passively accept whatever policies are being pursued in our name. We need to demand transparency, ethical conduct, and a foreign policy that reflects our values.
Yeah.
So where do we go from here? What are some potential paths forward when it comes to U.S. involvement in these types of conflicts?
Well, that's the million-dollar question, isn't it? Feels like we've uncovered a whole web of complexities here. And no easy answers.
Yeah, it does. It really does.
There are no simple solutions when it comes to the challenges posed by proxy wars, but I think this deep dive has at least highlighted some crucial points to consider moving forward. Firstly, we really need to recognize that proxy wars are not a cost-free endeavor. They come with, significant financial burdens, the potential for, getting entangled militarily, and lasting impacts on our international reputation.
Yeah, it's like we've been trying to play this game without fully understanding the rules or the potential consequences.
Right. And secondly, we can't afford to ignore the ethical dimension here. Supporting groups that are engaged in human rights abuses, even indirectly, it really undermines our credibility and contradicts, our stated values. It also risks fueling further instability and creating more enemies than it eliminates.
So it really is a balancing act, weighing security concerns against ethical considerations and long-term strategic goals. Makes me think back to what you said earlier about blowback. It's like we're so focused on the immediate threat that we fail to see how our actions could create even bigger problems down the line.
That's a critical insight. It really underscores the need for a more thoughtful and strategic approach to foreign policy. We need to move beyond those simplistic notions of good guys and bad guys and recognize the complexities of these conflicts. We need to invest in diplomacy, conflict resolution, and really addressing those root causes of instability.
Yeah.
And we need to hold ourselves and our partners to a higher standard when it comes to human rights.
It's a tall order, but it feels like a necessary one if we actually want to create a more stable and just world. I'm also wondering, what role the public can even play in all of this. I mean, these issues can feel so overwhelming and distant. Like, what can we even do as individuals to make a difference?
That's a great question. I'm glad you brought that up. Public awareness and engagement are crucial. We need to, stay informed about these complex issues, have, open and honest discussions about the costs and consequences of our actions, and hold our elected officials accountable for the decisions they make in our name.
So it's about educating ourselves, having those tough conversations, and making our voices heard.
Absolutely. And it's about demanding transparency and accountability from our government. We can't simply outsource our foreign policy to a select few. We need to be active participants in shaping the direction of our nation's engagement with the world.
That's a powerful message. It's a reminder that we all have a stake in this and a responsibility to be informed and engaged citizens. Well, I think our brains are officially full after this deep dive. We've covered a lot of ground, from the historical context of proxy wars to their modern manifestations, the ethical dilemmas they pose, and the potential for blowback.
It's been a fascinating exploration, and I appreciate you giving me the opportunity to share these insights.
And thank you for joining us on this journey, listener. We hope this deep dive has given you a better understanding of this complex world of proxy wars and the challenges that they present. Remember, staying informed and engaged is the first step toward creating a more peaceful and just world. Keep asking those tough questions, keep seeking out diverse perspectives, and keep the conversation going. Until next time,